You reach out your hand right now, today, without thinking about it. A stranger reaches back. Your palms meet, your fingers close. It takes less than 2 seconds, and you barely register it as anything at all. But you just performed a ritual that is thousands of years old, and the people who invented it were not being polite. They were checking to see if you were about to kill them. Picture a marketplace in the ancient world. Dust, noise, the smell of livestock and bread. Two men approach each other, and neither one knows the other's intentions. A blade could be hidden in a sleeve. A grudge could be waiting behind a smile. So one man extends his right hand, palm open, fingers spread. The other grips it back. In that instant, both hands are empty. Both hands are accounted for. Neither man can draw a weapon without the other feeling it first. That is where your handshake came from. Not warmth, not friendliness, survival. And the truth goes back thousands of years, and it's stranger than you think. Historians used to treat the handshake as a small, almost invisible custom, barely worth studying. A footnote. But the deeper researchers looked, the more they realized this tiny gesture was doing enormous work in the ancient world. It wasn't primitive, it was a piece of technology, built out of flesh and trust instead of metal and stone. It solved a problem that every ancient society faced the moment strangers began to trade, travel, and negotiate with people outside their own family or tribe. How do you prove, instantly and wordlessly, that you mean no harm? You couldn't run a background check on a merchant from 3 cities away. You couldn't call ahead and vouch for a stranger's character. You had one tool, and only one, your own body, held open and unarmed in front of someone who could just as easily be an enemy as a friend. And so ancient people turned the simple act of touching hands into a kind of contract. One that didn't need writing, didn't need a translator, and didn't need witnesses. It could be understood by absolutely anyone, in any language, in any city, along the trade routes that stitched the ancient world together. Think about how strange that really is. A civilization could build a wall so precise you couldn't slide a blade between the stones. It could raise a temple that has outlasted its own gods by thousands of years. And yet one of its most enduring inventions was something you could do with 2 open palms and no tools at all. No stone, no bronze, nothing but the risk of your own exposed hand. What does that tell you about what these people actually valued? Not just walls, not just weapons. Trust itself, engineered like an object, small enough to fit in your palm and strong enough to outlast empires. Consider what the alternative looked like. Without a shared gesture like this, every meeting between strangers carried real, immediate risk. A misread glance could end in a knife between the ribs. A misunderstood approach could start a feud that outlived both men involved in it. Entire trade routes depended on total strangers finding some way in seconds to signal that this particular encounter would not end in violence. Coinage helped. Shared gods helped sometimes. But nothing traveled faster or worked more universally than a hand, held out, palm empty, fingers spread wide enough for anyone watching to see there was nothing to hide. Now walk into the sun-bleached cemetery of ancient Athens, just outside the old city walls, in a district called the Kerameikos. For over a century, archaeologists have carefully uncovered rows of carved marble slabs there, grave markers called stelae, each one telling the story of a life that ended long ago. And on an astonishing number of them, you find the exact same image, carved again and again across decades of different families, different sculptors, different generations, 2 figures clasping hands. Classical archaeologist Judith Barringer, who has spent years studying Greek funerary art, points to this recurring gesture as one of the most common images in all of Greek grave sculpture. The Greeks even had a word for it, dexiosis, the right-hand clasp. And it wasn't carved onto tombs to show 2 strangers making a deal in a marketplace. It was carved to show a farewell, a husband gripping the hand of the wife he was leaving behind in death, a father clasping his son's hand one final time, frozen forever in marble. Walk the rows of the Kerameikos today and you notice something else. The clasped hands rarely look strained or dramatic. No wide eyes, no open mouths. The figures usually meet each other's gaze with a kind of quiet steadiness, as if the sculptor wanted you to feel calm standing in front of grief rather than overwhelmed by it. That restraint was deliberate. A culture obsessed with dramatic myth, with monsters and gods and violent legends, chose the plainest gesture imaginable to represent its most painful moments. Not a scene of mourning, not tears carved into stone, just two hands meeting, refusing to separate. Here is the open loop worth sitting with. If the handshake began as proof that you weren't holding a weapon, why would grieving families carve it onto tombstones, where no one was in any danger at all, where the only two people involved were often already separated by death itself? The answer takes you somewhere you don't expect, because somewhere between the marketplace and the graveyard, the meaning of the gesture had shifted. It stopped being only about safety. It became about bond. A handshake didn't just say, "I will not harm you." It grew into something closer to, something connects us, and that connection does not end even now. The Greeks placed it on tombs because they believed the clasp represented a tie between the living and the dead that death itself could not sever. Two open hands permanently locked in stone, refusing to let go no matter how many centuries passed over the grave above them. That single carved gesture was doing the emotional work an entire eulogy does today, compressed into a shape you could carve in an afternoon, and that would still be legible thousands of years later. Now follow the gesture west, into Rome, where it evolved again, and this time it became something closer to a legal signature carved in flesh. The Romans called their version the dextrarum iunctio, the joining of right hands, and they used it everywhere a promise needed to be sealed publicly and permanently. On coins struck to celebrate a peace treaty between rival factions so that every hand the coin passed through would carry the message of the truce. On sarcophagi showing a husband and wife joined at the hand to represent their marriage vows, outlasting both of their bodies. In official ceremonies, when an alliance between commanders needed to be made visible to an entire army at once, with no scroll to read aloud, no translator standing between two languages, and no delay for anyone to misunderstand what had just been agreed. Historian Susan Walker, who has examined Roman funerary sculpture extensively, including work connected to the Ashmolean Museum's collections, has noted how often the dextrarum iunctio appears on Roman tomb reliefs specifically to mark marriage, since Roman couples wanted their eternal monument to capture the single gesture that had legally and emotionally bound them together in life. Think about that choice for a moment. Out of every possible image a Roman family could carve to represent a marriage, forever, in stone, for strangers centuries later to still be reading, they chose two clasped hands. Not a kiss, not a feast, a handshake. And the Romans didn't stop at marriage. Roman coins minted to mark a treaty between legions or a truce between the Senate and a rival power often showed two hands clasped above the word fides, the Latin word for trust, loyalty, good faith. That single coin, passed hand to hand through markets from one end of the empire to the other, carried a political message that needed no translation. Whoever received it in payment for bread or wine or cloth was, for a moment, holding a tiny bronze or silver reminder that an agreement existed and had been sealed. The empire didn't just build roads to move its message, it built a gesture small enough to fit inside a coin purse. But here's the twist that should genuinely unsettle you. This gesture, one of the most tender and trusted symbols in the ancient world, only worked in the first place because it was rooted in the exact opposite of trust. It began as a threat detection system, a subtle, split-second pat-down disguised as affection, a way of frisking a stranger without either one of you ever having to admit that's what was happening. And it gets stranger still. Some historians studying the gestures spread across the Mediterranean have pointed out that the up and down motion many cultures eventually added to the handshake. That little pump after the initial grip may have started as something even more literal than a greeting. A way to shake loose anything hidden up a sleeve, a blade, a coin, a folded note meant to pass unseen. Two people testing each other, one final time, wrapped inside what looks to every onlooker like the warmest gesture humans make to one another. So the handshake carries two completely opposite meanings fused into a single motion that takes less time than a heartbeat. Suspicion and affection, threat and trust. A leftover instinct from a violent, uncertain world, repurposed by grieving families and newlywed couples into the single image they wanted to represent love strong enough to survive death itself. Now think about the excavation records because they tell you just how far this really spread. across sites throughout the ancient Mediterranean, from Greek burial grounds to Roman provincial cemeteries. Stretching as far as North Africa and the edges of Roman Britain, archaeologists keep finding the same clasped hands carved over and over on tombs, on coins, on rings, on wax seals used to close private letters. The same two hands in different languages, different religions, different centuries. A gesture doesn't spread that far, that consistently, across that many unrelated cultures, unless it is solving a problem every single one of them desperately needed solved. And that problem never actually went away. Merchants meeting merchants they had never seen before and would likely never see again. Soldiers negotiating truces they couldn't fully verify. Strangers forced in an instant to decide whether to fight or to cooperate, with nothing to go on but a look and a grip. The handshake became a kind of universal password, understood on every trade route from the Aegean coastline to the furthest edges of the Roman world, long before anyone shared a common language, a common currency, or a common god to swear an oath to. Which brings you back to your own hand. Every time you meet someone new today, at a job interview, at a wedding, closing a deal across a desk, you are not inventing a small gesture of politeness. You are performing a ritual that ancient Greeks carved onto the graves of the people they loved most, and that ancient Romans stamped onto coins meant to travel across an entire empire. You are proving in the same wordless 2-second motion strangers used along dusty trade roads thousands of years ago that your hand is empty, and that whatever comes next between you and this other person can be built on something sturdier than luck. Modern etiquette experts will tell you a firm handshake conveys confidence. What they rarely mention is that firmness was never really about confidence at all. It was about making absolutely sure the other person's grip couldn't be hiding anything you needed to fear, back when a weak, uncertain grip might genuinely have gotten you killed. You can still see the fingerprints of that old fear in the etiquette rules that survive today. Why does tradition insist on the right hand specifically, even now, in a world where almost no one carries a blade to a business meeting? Because the right hand was the weapon hand for most people in the ancient world, and offering it first, open, was the clearest possible signal you could send. Why do people still instinctively distrust a stranger who won't make eye contact during a handshake? Because eye contact meant you weren't watching for an opening, weren't scanning for a second hand reaching toward a hidden blade. None of that violence exists in your daily life anymore, but your body still runs the old program thousands of years later without you ever noticing it. So the next time your hand meets another person's in an office, at a doorway, or at the edge of a grave, remember what your ancestors were really doing the first time they closed that same grip around a stranger's palm. They weren't just saying hello. They were checking if they were about to die. And somehow, out of that fear, standing in a dusty marketplace thousands of years before you were born, they built one of the most enduring symbols of trust the world has ever carried forward. One that still passes, unbroken, from your hand into the next, strangers, every single day.